Living photograph. I shouldn't have bought that photo album. I tell myself that every time I see it, sitting on the shelf like an unwanted guest. It was supposed to be a curiosity, something old and forgotten, buried in a pile of junk at the flea market. The vendor, a wiry old man with shaking hands, barely glanced at me when I asked for the price. "Take it," he muttered, waving me away like a stray dog. I should have known then. When something feels too cheap, too easy, it's because the real cost isn't in dollars. It's in something else. It was a heavy album, bound in cracked leather, smelling of dust and mildew. The pages, thick and yellowed, held photographs so old that some were barely visible, blurred faces, faded scenery, black and white ghosts of people long dead. Most were mundane, family portraits, children playing in fields, old houses with peeling paint. But one photo stood out. Not because it was clearer, but because it wasn't. It was a group shot, taken in what looked like a park. Men in stiff suits, women in long dresses, all standing in a stiff, formal line. And there, in the far right corner, was a figure. Dark. Unclear. Almost like a smudge, except it had shape, like someone standing just outside the frame, half caught by the camera. I squinted, bringing the photo closer. No face. No details. Just a vague silhouette, watching. I flipped through the pages, faster now, a sick feeling curling in my stomach. Another photo, a different family, a different scene, but the same smudge. Same shadowy figure lurking in the corner. Page after page, different years, different people, but always there. Sometimes farther, sometimes closer, but never absent. It was like a bad joke, a recurring nightmare playing out across time. That night, I couldn't sleep. The album sat on my nightstand, its presence gnawing at me. Around 2 a.m, I got up, turned on the lamp, and opened it again. My heart hammered as I found the first picture and held it under the light. The figure had moved. It was closer. Just slightly, but unmistakably so. I went back to the others, flipping in a frenzy, sweat slicking my hands. Closer. Every time I looked, it had shifted. Not a trick of my mind. Not a misremembered detail. It was getting nearer. I slammed the album shut, shoved it under the bed, and sat in the dark, staring at nothing, waiting for morning. By morning, I had almost convinced myself it was my imagination. Lack of sleep, poor lighting, a brain too eager to find patterns where none existed. That's what I told myself as I made coffee, as I stared at my reflection in the kitchen window, dark circles under my eyes. But I didn't dare check the album again. Not yet. The day dragged. Work was a blur of emails and pointless meetings, but the weight of that album sat in the back of my mind like an itch I couldn't scratch. By the time I got home, the sun was already setting, long shadows stretching across the floor. I hesitated at the bedroom door. The album was still under the bed, right where I had shoved it. A stupid, childish fear gnawed at me. I turned on every light in the apartment before pulling it out. With shaking hands, I flipped to the first photograph. The figure was there. Closer. No doubt about it now. What had once been a smudge in the distance was now a defined shape. A person. Still shadowed, still featureless, but with a clearer outline, broad shoulders, a hint of arms. Like something stepping out of a fog. I went to the next page. Closer still. My pulse pounded. I flipped through faster, my breathing ragged. The shadow moved forward with every page, every glance. And then I reached the last picture, the one that hadn't been there before. It was me. Sitting in my living room. Right now. The same dim lighting, the same open album in my hands. And behind me, standing in the doorway, was the figure. I spun around so fast I nearly fell off the couch. The doorway was empty. No shadow, no figure. But the air was thick, like the room was holding its breath. I grabbed my phone, snapped a picture of the doorway, and looked at the screen with my stomach in knots. Nothing. I exhaled, a nervous, breathless laugh escaping me. Maybe I was losing my mind. Maybe this was all some elaborate prank, some old photographer's idea of a joke. I didn't know. But I did know one thing, I wasn't keeping that album another night. I shoved it into a grocery bag, threw on my jacket, and drove. I didn't know where I was going at first, just that I wanted it gone. The flea market was closed. The thrift store was locked up for the night. I considered a dumpster, but that felt wrong, like it wouldn't be far enough. Then I remembered an old bridge on the outskirts of town, where the river ran deep and fast. By the time I got there, the sky was a deep purple, the last traces of daylight bleeding out. I parked, grabbed the bag, and walked to the edge. The river churned below, black and endless. I hesitated only a second before hurling the album over the railing. It hit the water with a barely audible splash, swallowed instantly by the current. I stood there for a long time, listening to the water, to the wind. Then I went home. Sleep came easier that night. I told myself it was over. Whatever weird trick my mind had played on me, whatever nightmare I had conjured from an old book of forgotten faces, it was gone now. The album was gone. I could move on. And then, at 3 a.m, my phone buzzed. Half asleep, I reached for it, blinking at the screen. New photos saved to your gallery. My mouth went dry. I sat up slowly, heart pounding, my hand trembling as I opened the gallery. There was a new picture. Taken in the dark. My bedroom. And in the corner of the frame, barely visible in the shadows, the figure. Closer than ever. I stared at the screen, my pulse hammering so hard I could hear it in my ears. The photo was grainy, dark, taken from the foot of my bed as if something, had been standing right there while I slept. The silhouette was no longer just a blurred mass. It had depth, presence. Shoulders hunched slightly, as if leaning forward. The suggestion of arms. A vague, indistinct head, featureless, but undeniably human-shaped. My throat tightened as I forced myself to look at every inch of the image, hoping for an explanation. Maybe it was a shadow cast by furniture. Maybe a trick of the dim light. But the longer I stared, the more impossible that seemed. The figure was solid. Present. The air in my bedroom felt suffocating, thick with something unseen. Every hair on my body stood on end as I lowered the phone, struggling to control the rapid, shallow breaths escaping my lips. I wanted to convince myself that this was a prank, that someone had broken in, snapped the photo, and left without a trace, but that made even less sense than the alternative. My door was locked. The windows shut. I had been alone. And yet, something had been here. Something close enough to capture its own presence in my phone's camera. A sick, creeping realization settled into my bones. The album was gone, but whatever was in it was not. The thought sent a cold wave through me, and I suddenly felt exposed, as if something was still watching from the dark corners of the room. I forced myself to move, jumping out of bed and flipping on every light in the apartment. My hands were shaking as I checked every door, every window. Locked. Secure. The apartment was empty, or at least it should have been. But no matter how many times I reassured myself, the feeling remained, a pressure in the air, a presence just out of reach. I deleted the photo. My fingers hovered over the screen for a moment before I did it, some part of me terrified that erasing it would only make things worse. But I couldn't stand to look at it. I needed it gone. The screen went blank, the image erased. I tried to convince myself that was enough, that whatever had happened would stop now. It didn't. The next night, I found another photo. This time, it wasn't just one. It was a series. A slow progression. Each one taken closer and closer, capturing me in my sleep, my body still and unaware. In the first, the figure stood at the doorway, barely visible in the darkness. In the second, it was at the foot of the bed. By the third, it was right next to me. The final image was the worst. Not because of what I saw, but because of what I didn't. There was no figure anymore. No shadow, no presence. Just me, lying there. And yet, the feeling of being watched had never been stronger. Panic surged through me like ice water. I threw the phone across the room, breathing heavily, my skin burning with the instinct to run, but run where? Whatever this was, it wasn't something I could escape. It wasn't bound to a place. It was bound to me. I barely slept, sitting in the living room with every light on, flinching at every creak of the building settling. My own apartment had become a trap, a space that no longer felt mine. The night stretched on, the seconds dragging like hours. I kept expecting to feel breath on the back of my neck, a whisper in my ear, a hand closing around my arm. But nothing came. Only the relentless silence and the knowledge that I wasn't alone. By morning, exhaustion weighed on me like a stone. My body ached, my mind sluggish with sleeplessness. I needed answers. There had to be something, some history tied to that album, some reason this was happening. I grabbed my phone, still cracked from when I had thrown it, and did what I should have done from the beginning. I searched. The flea market was held every week in different locations, run by a loose network of sellers who rarely stayed in one place. Finding the exact vendor who had sold me the album was nearly impossible. No receipts, no records. But something told me I wasn't the first person to experience this. Someone, somewhere, had to know something. I scrolled through forums, old newspaper archives, obscure blogs dedicated to paranormal mysteries. And then, finally, I found something. A story buried deep in the recesses of the internet, a forgotten post from nearly 20 years ago. A man had written about a photo album he had purchased at a flea market. He described finding strange images, ones that seemed to change when he wasn't looking. A shadowed figure appearing where there had been none before. Each time he looked, it moved closer. He tried to get rid of it. Burn it. Bury it. But it always came back. The final update to his post was brief. Panicked. He had been seeing things outside his windows, hearing footsteps at night. Then, nothing. No further posts. No replies. Just a digital ghost of a warning. My stomach turned. This wasn't just happening to me. It had happened before. And if that man's story was any indication, it didn't end well. I sat there, gripping my phone, pulse hammering as a new thought formed, one I had been trying to avoid since the beginning. If this thing could move through the photographs, what if it didn't need them anymore? What if it was already here? I didn't want to look. I knew that if I turned my head, if I acknowledged the feeling pressing against my spine, I'd see something I could never unsee. But I couldn't sit there forever, frozen in my own apartment, waiting for the unseen to take shape. My breaths came in short, uneven gasps as I forced myself to move, to turn slowly, inch by inch, toward the doorway of my bedroom. Empty. Or at least, that's what my eyes told me. But the feeling remained, thick and oppressive, like the charged air before a thunderstorm. I stood up on unsteady legs, my knees weak, my body screaming at me to leave. Run. Get out. But where? Whatever this was, it wasn't bound by walls. It had followed me from the photographs. It had watched me sleep. It had stood at my bedside. I couldn't just run, I needed to end this. With trembling hands, I picked up my phone again, scrolling back through the forums, through the man's old posts. I had to know how far it had gone for him. How it had ended. But the more I searched, the more I realized something that made my blood run cold. His account was gone. Not just abandoned. Erased. No posts, no profile, no trace that he had ever existed. But I had seen it. I had read it. Hadn't I? A shudder ran through me. My own reflection in the darkened screen of my phone looked off. The shadows under my eyes were deeper, my skin pale and stretched too tight over my bones. Or was that just my imagination? Lack of sleep? I didn't know anymore. I moved through my apartment like a ghost myself, checking every corner, every reflection, every surface that could betray movement where there should be none. But no matter how hard I looked, I saw nothing. Until I reached the hallway mirror. My stomach twisted into knots as I approached. The air around me was ice cold now, my breath visible in thin, shaking wisps. The mirror had always been there, unremarkable, something I passed 100 times a day without thought. But now, my skin prickled with the certainty that something was wrong. I stood before it, staring at my own reflection, willing myself to believe that it was just me. Just glass and light. But then, movement. Not mine. A flicker in the background. A shape standing just behind me, featureless, blacker than the shadows around it. I didn't turn. I didn't breathe. My mind screamed at me to run, to smash the mirror, to do anything but stand there staring. And then, my reflection blinked. But I hadn't. I stumbled back, my own breath strangled in my throat. The thing in the mirror didn't move toward me. It didn't lunge or change shape. It only watched. And for the first time, I understood the truth. The photographs had never been of the thing. They had been of me. And now, whatever had been watching me from behind the lens, was inside.